So it has been the idea of this anniversary program to revisit and actualize also what has been said, done, thought, discussed in the last 10 years, and I'm very happy that Nora is with us, who's most probably one of the oldest companions of Cultures of the Curatorial. She was, for example, already guest of our first conference in 2010 and published the text, What Can the Curatorial Learn from the Educational in the program's first anthology. So this input, I have to say, has very much inspired my very own practice, as I am, as Nora herself, a curator and educator, and her practice is also rooted pretty much in her practice as a co-founder and part of Bureau Trafocart, Office for Art, Education and Critical Knowledge Production, based in Vienna, together with Ines Garnicznik, Renate Höllwart and Elke Schmodic, and more current Free Thought, a platform for research, education and production based in London, together with Irit Rogov, Stefano Harni, Adrian Heathfield, who's also with us today, Mau Mologna and Luis Moreno. So, besides that, currently Nora is Documenta professor at the Kunsthochschule Kassel and co-director of ECM, Educating, Curating and Managing, a master program in exhibition theory and practice on the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, and was, last but not least, from 2012 to 2018 professor for curating and mediating art and director of the curatorial program to the University of Helsinki. Welcome, Nora. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this introduction and for being here and all your introductions. And of course, when preparing here, long after this 10 years ago conference, I couldn't help myself to look back. And so I will try to answer this question and also tell you some anecdotes of how I became who I am, also thanks to this whole context here. So my question is, how can we learn something that does not exist yet? And it is related to the fact that classically, that it might sound paradox when we read it first, because classically what is expected from educators is that they would teach something that already exists. They would transmit an existing knowledge to someone else. But this is neither what education nor what research has only been about. We could say that research actually, in somehow we all know it, should be about learning what we don't know yet, and in that way, if we relate it to Rancière, in that way, also something that didn't exist before we knew it, that we also create by knowing it. But even more education. If we think about the history of radical education, we will encounter an understanding of education that is actually an understanding that shouldn't exist in this world. So radical education means to learn another world, to learn something that might be a knowledge when the knowledge we have, the powerful knowledge in which we are completely embedded, is shifted. And from there, of course, my main reference figure is Antonio Gramsci, who wrote in his prison letters the well-known sentence, every relationship of hegemony is necessarily an educational relationship. So I just try to understand it from there. What does he mean? What he actually means, Gramsci, who is one of the founders of the Communist Party in Italy and writes it in a fascist prison, what he mainly means is that the fact, and in whatever way we are governed, the fact that we are governed is not only established through discipline and economies, but also through consensus and consent. So government exists because we believe in it. And that's why he says every relation of hegemony is necessarily an educational relationship. There is no other way than education to keep hegemony as it is. Now, Antonio Gramsci thinks in a time in Italy when the idea that education is not only going from one direction to the other, but also the other way around was pretty common. Reform pedagogy was in Italy since some years, and this is exactly what he thinks, that knowledge is not a one-way street. This means that if hegemony, in order to be powerful, has to be learned, it can also be questioned and agitated. So if we need to accept the existing power relations, we can also not accept them. And in this sense, work on another possible hegemony, a counter-hegemony, as many people say, but this is not what Gramsci says. For him, is hegemony, subaltern, and then the drive for hegemony. Okay, so this is very important because if we look at it in relation to a classical Marxist understanding, of course, this is absolutely not a model of infrastructure, superstructure, where you would have economy on the one hand and education as something else. No, it is a model in which you would say it is education, and with education he means also doing a journal. He founded, of course, together with colleagues, a very important newspaper, communist newspaper in Italy, Ordine Nuovo. So it's also doing a newspaper. I would say it's also the curatorial. It's also doing exhibitions. It's knowing together differently. And if we know differently, we already agitate not only the existing knowledge, but also the existing power relations. Now, my first lecture here was on education. It was on the history of radical education and relating it to these questions of the curatorial. And I am sure that I showed exactly this image. At least it is in my text. And this would be my first example from the times of Gramsci. This is Bertolt Brecht, the play The Mother. We are in the theater Schiffbauer Damm in Berlin, and we see around the table the mother and some workers, and at the blackboard the teacher. And so they enter actually the house of the teacher. I'm not sure if they're not occupied or, anyways, at some point they are there and they confront the teacher. They say, "Hello teacher, we don't know how to write. You have to teach us how to write because we need it for our struggle." Then the teacher says, "Yes, okay, no problem, why not? Let's sit down, I will explain to you." And he does this kind of mansplaining stuff, and he teaches them some words so that they can learn to write. So first he says, sit down, write down. Every word has some letters inside. So let's try with the word ast. And he writes that, ast, branch, nest, and fish. So the workers, they say, we don't need these words. They are not for us important. We need to learn what is for us important. So please take away your words, put on the blackboard worker, class struggle, and exploitation. The teacher says, I don't understand, it's not about words. It's about the letters. You have to learn the letters before you can write words. And then they say, which is very important, of course, they say, but the letters are in the word class struggle too. And that's the moment when the workers teach the teacher class struggle, and they are able to learn the words also through the letters, the words they need through the letters in them. So I think this is a very good example for, number one, learning going in both directions, and number two, by learning already imagining another world, that by doing that already happens a bit. Actually, there is a moment of solidarity coming up, and is a negotiation, but it's a potential that the teacher actually comes on their side while this happens. So many years ago I presented this. Some years later I worked on a project that I will talk about with you in Bergen, and I found this photograph about a cafe that existed in the 50s in London that was called Partisan Cafe, and was actually founded by 3 people. 2 of them at that time were very young and just finished their PhD. And after they finished their PhD, where they also founded a magazine in university that was called at that time Universities and Left Review, and is now still existing with the name New Left Review. While they did it, they couldn't imagine to do a journal without places to discuss it. Actually, these young people were also readers of Gramsci. They thought that there is no way they thought if we want to change the world in the 50s, we have to change culture. And this was the birth of cultural studies. They wanted to change culture as infrastructure. And the 3 people were Raphael Samuel, Stuart Hall, and Eric Hobsbawm. And together they managed to convince people to buy a house in Soho in London, and in the first floor of the house was a coffee house. The coffee house was called the Partisan. Of course, in the 50s, you can think about many things when you hear the Partisan. You can think about taking a stance, but you can also, of course, think about anti-fascist struggle. Now, here again, you have a photo from the everyday life in this coffee house, people sitting together around the table, reading, discussing, thinking together, maybe imagining another world, also to make it happen, the world that does not exist yet. And here is our city seminar in Bergen. I guess, so we did Bergen Assembly together with Free Thought. Adrian is here as well. And it was exactly 3 years ago, and I would say 5 years ago, we started with a city seminar. We went to Bergen once a month, and together with people we read and discussed, actually to understand what we are doing, and also to reconfigure what Bergen Assembly could be. So who do you see here as a teacher at the blackboard? It's Irit Rogov, she was already mentioned. And she is part of our, she's not only part, she's actually the founder of Free Thought, and we are now thinking to go further with something called infrastructure class. So, learning as a way to imagine another world and making it happen already now. A bit. So, of course, I was very impressed by all the things I learned when I was here at the conference, and I was also very, it was one of the first big lectures that I gave. Of course, I was super excited, and I listened to everyone, and I was also shifted myself very much and tried to understand. And between my lecture, where I just wanted to relate to radical education in relation to what the curatorial could be, and we all did not really understand what it meant at that time. We actually wanted to understand it together. Between this moment and my text was a lot of reflection about this weird thing that the curatorial is. Is it radical or not? And also you have to, I mean, you will see the whole day here, and with Beatrice von Bismarck and Cultures of the Curatorial is always like this. You are extremely excited and very critical about what you are doing at the same time, and honestly, this is disturbing. So I was very disturbed, and this was all working in me, and after that I knew that this will in summer also be the topic of my PhD. And the topic of something, let's say a research project, because my PhD was about something completely different. The topic of a research project that now became my book. And after this conference and all the discussions and all the lectures, for me, I couldn't describe it in another way than post-representational. I was in a very, of course, post-structuralist mood, reading Rancière and all this, and also so many years of critique of representation, and reading Irit Rogov and listening to her and getting to know her, and she makes me understand that I have to stop to always only criticize representation, but think about a possible practice. So here was my research question. It was about post-representational curating, and my actual question that was my working title for the book, that has now a completely different name, was What Comes After the Show. I presented this, I think 5 years ago or something, again here, and I gave many examples, and I presented all my thoughts about it and all the different strategies I gathered, post-representational radical strategies. And I asked, what could curating be if it is not about representation? And you might not wonder that Beatrice said, this won't happen. There is no way out of representation. So, of course, I was shocked, but she was right. And not only that, but also I realized that my naive run out of the representational mode was not only radical, but mainly complicit with new ways of governing us. Through mathematics and logistics that would far less trying to convince us through majestic representations than grasping us through what Stefano Hani and Irit Rogov called being accessed, through accessing us. So while I thought that I mainly governed through representation and critiqued it as a way of being political, I realized that I'm at least as much governed by other mechanisms that I would not be able to criticize if I'm only interested in what comes after the show. So here I am again, and I am very happy that I left the title What Comes After the Show behind, even if it became an answer with this conference, show and try again. In the book that now came out with the title Das Radikaldemokratische Museum, the Radical Democratic Museum, I follow this shock that I had, that I maybe should think further after the a bit stupid question of leaving representation behind. And at that point, I then came to another prefix, which is the para-institutional, the para-museum, a way to not leave it behind, but to be part of it, yet at the same time also related to an outside. If you think about, so this is actually the literal translation of the prefix para as a Greek prefix. So I started to be interested in para-institutional strategies, and again I gathered many examples, especially of artistic and curatorial para-museums and para-institutions. Here I would say that this might really be a way of curatorial and artistic knowledge production, even though it's not always a repetition. And I gathered many examples. I leave this here. One is very new now, is Voluspa Kappa, the Hegemony Museum at Venice Biennale. So I took it inside here because I thought it could help us again with a relation to Gramsci. So what she's doing is based on research on how canon is constructed and museums are organized, she's telling the history of hegemony, of power, of violence, but then also on the other side, she here the subaltern portrait gallery, also actually with an opera of emancipation. So here you have an artistic strategy using the means of the museum, not to make us feel that the museum, like many artists in the, let's say, 70s, 80s, who would do it to show how the museum is a mausoleum. No, it uses the means of the museum in order to actually look back critically, to reflect, it uses representation in order to criticize representation and already imagine another emancipatory world. And here's another example, and this is a very new work that the artist Isa Rosenberger has done for our next book that will come out in a month, which has the title Gegenöffentlichkeit organisieren. Kritisches Management im Kuratieren, so organizing counterpublics, critical management in curating, a book on rethinking organizational structures. And Isa Rosenberger went to Helsinki and made a portrait of an institution there that is called Museum of Impossible Forms. So here you already have this imagining, what would a museum be if it would be a museum of something that doesn't exist yet. A museum, a place of radical imagination. So Isa went there. It's a small institution in the second floor of a shopping mall in the east of Helsinki, and she interviewed the people who founded the place as a library, as an archive, as a collaborative working place. It's really a very important and beautiful place, I think. It was a conscious decision, they say, to come to the east of Helsinki and to come to this particular neighborhood and to locate ourselves in a mall in this specific context, because this is a historical working class neighborhood and we wanted to decenter counterproduction. And actually, it's really not a place of, so much a place of gentrification. There is an old shopping mall and it's in the second floor, this place. On the one side is a prayer room and on the other is a hairdresser beside it. The theme of our performances this year is the fierce urgency of now, a quote we've taken from Martin Luther King. So you see, it's clearly a place of emancipatory collectivity. And what I actually wanted, the core of the Museum of Impossible Forms is a library and an archive. The archive is imagined, real, and embodied. And here the most important project, I think, is a writing school in Arabic, and this writing school is led by a writer, I don't know if you know him, Hassan Blazim. Hassan Blazim is translated in many languages and actually a bestseller writer in Germany. So his German books are really read a lot, and this guy lives in Helsinki, and he is doing this writing school in the Museum of Impossible Forms. And as this was announced, turned out that many intellectuals work in this shopping mall, selling kebab, shoes, working in the hairdresser shop and so on. So it became a gathering place of the intellectuals of these small little shops all around. And together with Hassan Blazim, they start to write. And as writing is a very affective and of course also you open up process, it is really is a very intimate place also, because it's for many of these people the first time that they encounter and overcome imaginations about relations that are very much defined by the war or by different wars that happen in the moment. So, but the writing school is of course not the only thing. They also have a video, collaborative video production and so on. So this would be for me one example of this learning as a collaborative process to imagine another world and live it already now. Yeah, and here I'm sure I'm far too long, but I try to situate what I say within this context, so I make it rather quick. The actual examples I wanted to give you are from our project at Bergen Assembly in 2016, which in which we entered with a huge question mark about what infrastructure could mean in terms of in what way we are governed by infrastructures, but also in what way can infrastructures be thought as ways to relate in this world, as ways to change it, as ways to create little pockets of another possible world in the very within of this one. So here you see all the amazing people from whom I learned a lot, and I'm very, very happy that Adrian is here. So we did this project on infrastructure in 6 chapters and 3 performative platforms. Mao Molona, each of us following more or less a research question that was very situated in a concrete context. Mao on the end of oil, Stefano Hani together with amazing people like Ranjit Kandalgaonka, Juna Neumann Wutzang and Denise Ferreira da Silva on questions, on the meeting points between the logistics of shipping and the history of slavery and the shipped. Then Adrian Heathfield, who is here today with a movie, a movie on relations and memory and what can stay even after we die, Spirit Labor, and dance and affect and many other things, but you can talk with him. Luis Moreno with a project, Spectres of Infrastructure, that was actually researching on the relations between capitalism and affectivity. It was a machine that bought books at Amazon based on the feelings of the visitors. And then a project by Irit Rogov called Assembled Archives. I worked with her on this for many years, also with our students in Helsinki. And one part of it was to interview people about exhibitions that have been important for them and in what way. So this is Bonaventure and Kung telling about that. But another project, and let's go quickly there, in this assembled archives was the archive of the Partisan Cafe in the 50s in London, Soho. And I found out about it when I was watching the Stuart Hall movie by John Akomfra. And then I was like, this was a cafe in London in the 50s, and I had no idea about it. So then we found out that in London, actually, there is a historian who has a lot of material about it, about this cafe. He knows everything. The cafe only existed for 4.5 years, but the historian works on it for more than 10 years. So he has all the materials, and so thanks to him, we had the chance to show some very beautiful photographs, and we interviewed him. And here you see how it looked. Like, you can see the modernisms, the idea that culture would, bring us all further is inscribed also in the form. A place of gathering, a place of music, and so on. So here again, the people sitting together. Now, each of us had a research question, and my research question was, how can we act together in a world that isolates us? And then we were looking for a venue. And they show us 2 venues that have been something else before. The former prison and the former fire station. So obviously, when you are the curator of a biennale or triennale, like in Bergen, you will be confronted with places that are in transition. Has something to do with the absolute implicatedness of triennales in urban transformation processes. So for us, it was clear that we don't want to do it in the former prison, but the former fire station is very beautiful, is in the city center, and everyone thinks, yes, let's do it there. So you immediately start to dream, you have your own Photoshop in your head. Yeah, let's do a Partisan Cafe here in this beautiful fire station. So we go around and we have a tour by the people of the city and of Bergen Assembly, a 2-hour tour. They show it to us as if we would like to buy it. And they say, it's amazing, it's so wonderful, but it will be a bit difficult. It will be a bit difficult, but if you really want the place, we can make it happen. So we try to understand why. Why is it difficult to get the place? But we walk around and we see this beautiful amateur museum who is already inside. So they tell us it's occupied. So then, of course, what do you mean it's occupied? Who is occupying it? Yes, it's occupied by retired firemen. And the retired firemen occupied a place because they wanted it to be a fire museum and not a shopping mall or whatever the city would do with it. So then, of course, we realized that we are in summer also used. What does it mean? Should we take the place and then they would have to go out? And then I immediately turned back to my research question. So here, how can I learn something that doesn't exist yet? my research question was, how can we act together in a world that isolates us? Obviously a moment of being isolated. Them against us. So what can the gentrifier do in relation to the gentrified? Is there a way, or is this naive and stupid and so on? What was clear for me was that with my research question, there is no way that I would say, yes, great, let's take the place and let's get rid of them. I mean, of course. So what the reaction was, and it was wonderful that we went there with Stefano and I think also Adrian. So what we proposed was that we said, if it is occupied, we actually don't have to negotiate with the city, we have to negotiate with the occupiers. And we met the occupiers and asked them if it would make sense for them to share the space during Bergen Assembly with a temporary alliance, a project that I would do with an artist, Isa Rosenberger, and that would be called the Museum of Burning Questions. Being honest with them and saying, of course, that, and also not being honest with them, they were also, they immediately understood and knew that burning questions doesn't mean fire museum. They have a fantastic collection of historical firefighting objects from not only Bergen but Scandinavia. And burning questions would relate to it on the one hand, but also in many ways bring up other topics and so on. After a discussion that was heated, but clearly the majority on our side, they all agreed with doing it. So we would be in the occupied fire station, occupied by the retired firemen of Bergen. They would be 2 days every week with us, and we would, let's say, live the Museum of Burning Questions in the occupied fire station. This is the assembly space of the firemen where we met and where we proposed this, where they said yes. This is the history of the old main fire station in Christie Street. So just to show you that we found this already there. There is a whole amateur museum work that has been done when we came. And then we decided to just move in solidarity in this occupied fire station. The Museum of Burning Questions, we said, is a space to think and debate with the Partisan Café as its central contact zone. So then, here's some pictures by the artist Isa Rosenberger, who did a very beautiful documentation of the struggle of the firemen. And here, an artwork by Ariel Schlesinger, Fires Need Audiences. This tote bag that we produced for the campaign of the Museum of Burning Questions is actually deliberately anti-site specific. It was done for the CCA in Tel Aviv. And of course there it means something completely different. So it was also to bring up these different meanings of what a Museum of Burning Questions could mean, also dialectically, because maybe sometimes we would want to have more and sometimes less fire. Who knows? And then the Partisan Café as the central contact zone, the space of assembly within the Museum of Burning Questions. And this was a collaborative project that we, in labor conditions and in all other ways, conceptualized together with Thora Endestedt-Björkheim, Freya Beckmann, who is here, Kabi Carter, Johnny Herbert, Jenny Moore, Anis Koch-Olsen. And we met 3 times for a week to imagine together what such a self-defined educational space could be. And here you see the colleagues. And I also brought a movie, but I think we don't have time for that. But it was really interesting, and this is what I would also like if people would like to talk about with me about that in the workshop. The way how we defined the working conditions of the people we called educators, coffee makers, and performers at the same time, the way we worked to define them was a manifesto. So together in these 2 weeks, when we gathered, we wrote the Partisan Café Post Manifesto. And this manifesto was actually making manifest the working conditions, the labor conditions people would expect during this this triennale. It would be about how they want to work, where they, what the context would be in which they work, what they would mean, we would mean by education, what we would mean by performance, and so on. And my proposal is that in the workshop I present this manifesto and we discuss it if it makes sense or not and in what way. Yeah, just quickly the question. So my main question, how can we learn and act together in a world that isolates us? And of course, by doing this, already imagining another world that would not isolate us completely. What is a curatorial project beside and beyond representations? And how can we learn something that doesn't exist yet? And in many reading sessions, discussions, concerts, moments of exhaustion, very, very public projects and very hidden things that you had to know in order to come, we tried to find answers to these questions, or at least tried to follow them. Thanks a lot.